How many of us have ever been in that position where actually we've ever had an opportunity to give a prayer and it's kind of turned into that, or you have been the recipient of a grace done just like that? I appreciate that so much because for me that kind of puts in a nutshell grace. Grace, he has no idea what it is, and most of us don't either. I mean, how many of us are in a similar position as that character was? Don't know exactly what grace is. I mean, we say things like grace before dinner, or there by the grace of God go I. We name our children Grace. We walk by grace. We watch dancers who are graceful. Yet, do we really ponder this thing called grace? Perhaps my favorite grace quote comes from Anne Lamott, who says, "I do not at all understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us where it found us." I love that. Another definition of grace, it's often defined as a gift freely given, an unmerited favor from God. In the Old Testament, we often highlight God's judgment. But actually, in the Old Testament, there is a recognition of God being a graceful God as well. You see that quite often in the Psalms. In the epistles, Paul's epistles, what you find there is one who recognizes and lives by the power of grace, not because of what he does, but because of what God did for him and all of us. I love Paul because Paul is one of those folks that had this amazing transformation in his life. His name was Saul. He moved to Paul, and he was struck down by God's essentially amazing grace. And it was in that grace that he lived from that day forth. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, talks about grace in 3 different forms. Now, don't get worried. I'm not going to get all Methodist on the garden. But this is a pretty interesting take on grace. For Wesley, there were 3 forms of grace. The first was prevenient grace. That is the grace that God has covered the world with and is there for everybody. It is an indiscriminate grace. It covers everybody at all times. When you choose to recognize that grace, you then become justified by that grace. So then you accept the grace of God. And for Wesley, he called that justified. And then finally, when you live into the power of that grace, sharing with everyone you encountered, you live a sanctified life or a sacred life in the power of God's grace. Perhaps grace is best known, though, by the song that we heard earlier today. And this is, in fact, the fullest understanding of grace that I have. It was written by a guy named John Newton. John Newton was born in 1725. His mother, a devout Christian, died when he was a very young man, and he was raised by his father, who was a sea captain. Now, we all know that everybody in life has challenges, but John Newton had amazing challenges, and he was not a very nice man. In fact, he ended up going into the slave trade as a captain of a ship. And he would bring people in on these slave trades. He would bring these slaves in, and he treated them as commodities. He never treated them as human beings. He never treated them as people with soul and being. They were simply just like goods that he had to trade. There is a story about how John Newton ended up in a rough sea one night with a boat full of slaves. It was a very rough sea, and he saw that there was no way for them to get out of this. So in the midst of the crashing storms and the crashing waves, he from nowhere ended up saying, "God, have mercy on me. Lord, have mercy on all of us." Guess what? Boat didn't sink. They were able to make it into harbor safely, and he was forever changed. This terrible man was forever changed because in that moment, he didn't recognize mercy or grace. He tapped into the mercy and grace that God had provided, and it was at that moment that he recognized it and became justified, and his life changed forever. It was from that point on, that pivotal moment and that point on, where Newton was able to say, that through the most difficult storms and challenges of life, there is God's amazing grace that will see you through. When the storms of life are raging, God's amazing grace will see you through. He knew that amazing grace. As we move into our prayer time today, I want to encourage all of you to think a little bit about grace, the role of grace in your life. Have you ever chosen to accept it? Yeah, God covers me with grace. Not only accept it, but to live in such a way that you share grace with each soul you come into contact with. Maybe you come here today in the midst of a big storm, or you know someone else who is in the midst of a big storm, or you have a storm that you can't stop thinking about. As we move into this prayer time, be mindful of God's grace that covers all of our challenges and the power of that grace and mercy. Ken's going to lead us in prayer today. Hard to believe that was almost 1 year ago. June 17th was the day that a young man, Dylan Roof, went into Reverend Pickney's church and killed 9 participants of a Bible study. I so appreciated our president at that moment, and I still appreciate him now, but the more I study grace, I recognize that grace, and what's so amazing about grace, is that we're all covered. 9 people were named by the president. There was one more. Dylan Roof, the young man who committed this terrible act, is covered by God's grace. And God's grace is sufficient for all. That's why grace is so amazing. Grace is sufficient for all. I don't know about you, but I cannot comprehend a grace that would cover somebody who would participate in such evil acts. But God does it again and again and again. Covers all of us, always. I mentioned earlier that Paul was kind of a rough character, and that John Newton was a rough character as well. I love Matthew Veer. Matthew Veer and I have great conversations, and Matthew always calls me out because he says sometimes, I use this church language, and I'm a church language girl. And it's a foreign language to a lot of people, and I love that he calls me out, and most of the time I listen to him unless I'm talking about grace. Then I use words like justified and sanctified. And then I also want to use this word too. I'm so glad they changed it this morning. But Newton calls himself what? A wretch. Friends, if you read back in the history of this slave trader, he was a wretch. He was a terrible, terrible person. Now let me define wretch again. Defined as despicable, unfortunate, unhappy, and a scoundrel. Yet when he recognized the power of God's grace, justified, the prevenient grace, justified, and lived a sacred life, God changed so many lives through him. He wanted to be a pastor, and the church said, heck no, you're not going to be a pastor. But guess what? He kept going until he became a pastor and wrote thousands of hymns that have transformed the world, transformed the lives of many. In fact, this very hymn is the most recorded, the most arranged hymn song of all times. Because that wretch recognized God's grace and then chose to live in that power. Dylan Roof, the young man who killed 9 people, also has access to that grace. And perhaps the only way that he will experience that amazing grace is through people like you and me who know the power of God's amazing grace. Perhaps just one conversation with him, living in that sacred grace, could make a difference. We have a clip for you today from Dead Man Walking, where one person had the willingness to walk the journey with another in the power of God's grace. And well, take a look at what happens when we live in the power of grace. So grace, where is it? It's in the water, it's on the land, it's above us, it's below us, it's within us. That's the power of grace. In 2002, a satellite went into orbit, and her name is Grace. Her name is Grace. It's Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. Her job is to watch over the precious resources of the earth and then send the information back to people who are paying attention to it, and then they use that information to share in the care of our creation. I think that's an incredible image for the power of God's grace in our lives. God's grace covers all. That's the tiniest stream to the largest ocean. And what's so amazing about it is when you take time to recognize God's grace, you can live into it, sanctified. You can live into it in a way that you can make a difference in the world. I mentioned earlier the psalmist talks about God's grace. The psalmist talks about God's grace in recognition that, well, we're really just this teeny tiny thing in this amazing universe. Here in Psalm 8, the psalmist says, God, I look up at your macro skies, dark and enormous, your handmade sky jewelry, moon and stars mounted in their settings. Then I look at my micro self and wonder, why do you bother with us? Why take a second look our way? Yet we've so narrowly missed being God's, bright with Eden's dawn light. You put us in charge of your handcrafted world, repeated to us your Genesis charge, made us lords of the sheep and the cattle, even animals out in the wild, birds flying and fish swimming, whales singing in the ocean depths. God, brilliant Lord, your name echoes around the world. Not only are we these teeny tiny beings, but we're these teeny tiny beings that God, our Creator, is choosing to work through in the power of grace. Grace is sure covering the earth, but it transforms the earth through people like you and me having a willingness to live in that power of grace. Now, I have to tell you, when I think about God's grace covering me, I'm pretty gall darn excited about it. But then I think about those people I'm not so excited about, and I have to remember that they're living in God's grace too. And somehow, if we both find a way to live in God's grace, perhaps we can make it through the teeny tiny challenges to live in this amazing universal grace that God has blessed us with. Caroline Niss is a modern-day mystic. I don't know if you've ever read anything by her. But she kind of follows the power of the Spirit. And she said one day she was working at home and she decided, wait a minute, I need to be walking. It's a beautiful day. So she followed the instinct, went out and went for a walk. She walked for a long while, ended up getting thirsty, ended up getting herself an iced tea. And when she sat down to drink that iced tea, she started working on her text messages or whatever it was, messages she was working on, when she suddenly felt a presence. And she looked up, and there sat a man very disheveled, a man who was clearly in need. Her human desire was to go back to the text messages. But alas, grace stepped in, as she says. She looked up and said, "Are you thirsty?" And he said, "Yes, I am." So she started on her way to get him something to drink. She turned back around and said, "Are you hungry too?" And he said, "Yes." She went and got him something to eat and drink, and then she shared and had a conversation with him. In the midst of this conversation, she was reminded of the nuns who used to say, "There by the grace go I," that she had grown up with. Now, that statement has gotten a bad rap in recent years because some people think it means I'm living in God's grace, but you're not. But today we've learned that that is not the case. What she experienced in that moment was God's grace was present, as real as the air that they were breathing, the two of them. She realized that it was a God grace moment and that God was transforming her and this man through the experience. They had a long conversation. And after that conversation, she said to herself, "There, by the grace, go I. There, by the grace, go I. May it lead my steps. May it lead my journey. There, by the grace, go I, and you, and you, and you, transforming the world." This is the prayer that came from that experience. God, I never know where I will find grace or how grace will speak to me. Some days it is through a world repeated to us and a love repeated to us. Each day I become more aware of something I did not understand or realize before. I know I should be grateful for all that I have, but now I realize I should also be grateful for that which I do not have. For I do not have traumatic war memories, and I do not have scars from being a refugee, and I do not have the fear of a homeless person. I am grateful for all I have and all I do not have. If I am grateful for having been spared a suffering, then give me the grace to help those who are suffering. Amen. Today I invite you to live in the power of God's amazing grace, prevenient grace above you, justified grace recognized within you, and sanctified grace living in the power of that graceful Spirit. For if we all find a way to live in this manner, perhaps, every day could be a beautiful day.